when including non-partner sexual violence. Our region also has one of the highest rates of femicide in the world, the most brutal type of violence committed against women and girls. Unfortunately, these figures represent only the tip of the iceberg because there is a great deal of underreporting when it comes to victims of violence. To address this issue, which impacts not only women but society as a whole, it is crucial to have a thorough understanding of the risk factors associated with violence and what policies and programs are effective in preventing and responding to this problem. GD Lab, the IDB Group's Gender and Diversity Knowledge Initiative, is dedicated to producing and disseminating rigorous and sound research to address this and other challenges facing women and diverse groups. I am Karen Martinez, and together with my colleagues Montserrat Bustelo and Claudia Martinez, we coordinate GD Lab, an initiative that is driven by the Gender and Diversity Division of the Social Sector and the IDB's Research Department. Today, I invite you to join us in this new episode of our series Evidence for Inclusion, in which we will talk with authors of 3 GD Lab-supported studies that offer new perspectives on risk factors and policy design to address violence against women. Montserrat Bustelo, lead economist in the Gender and Diversity Division of the Social Sector, will moderate this session. Welcome, Monse. I give you the floor.
Thank you, Karen. I wish to greet all of you who are with us virtually during this conversation. It's a pleasure to introduce our panelists today. I have Sandra Aguilar Gomez, who is a researcher and professor in economics at the University of Los Andes, and Julia Lamartina, who works at the University of Southern Florida. Welcome, both of you. It's a pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you so much, Montserrat, and thank you all of you on the team.
Thank you for having us.
It's truly a pleasure to have you with us. And we also have with us from Canada, Tommy Murphy, virtually, who is an associate professor at the Faculty of Economics at the University of San Andres and the scientific coordinator. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you. As Karen mentioned, in spite of the relevance and the urgency of having to act to prevent and address violence against women, based on the evidence we have, we see that there are certain limitations. This is why we're trying to share what we have learned from your studies, trying to widen what we know about this problem and trying to contribute toward creating better and more effective policies. Let's do the following. On screen, you will see the main heading or the main message of your study. The format is a heading as on newspapers, and then we will go on with the conversation with all of you. Are you all ready? Yes. I would like to start with you, Sandra. This is the heading that we see with your study. There's evidence that shows that there's a relationship between natural disasters and the increase in violence against women. Sandra, your investigation, your research shows us that there is a quantification that could be correlated between natural disasters and violence against women. This is an area that has not been studied that much in literature. Because of the relevance of your findings, I'd like to know how you can summarize how your study could be expressed in terms of the quantification and the use of these incidents in your study. I think that first of all, I'd like to start with the methodology. This is the result of an effort we researched and we gathered information from all of the health departments in our country, a decade of police reports, as well as hundreds of requests for information, to gather information for the emergency calls throughout the country to understand how these three variables, these three measurements of domestic violence responded to the conditions of a drought. So what we did was study a drought at the municipal level and these incidents over 8 years. What we did that was that we linked all this, and we see that local economies are dependent upon agriculture during certain periods of the year where drought would have even a greater impact on domestic violence. In terms of the literature, I believe that this study interacts with a few topics that I wish to underline. The so-called link that there is between gender and climate. This is an expression, this is a buzzword that people are using now. However, quantitative evidence and rigorous evidence, what we call causal evidence, describing this link is insufficient at the time. And this is where we try to come in, trying to quantify how, in the case of Mexico, for example, which is the context of our study, there is a reaction in terms of greater vulnerability from women and an increase in violence, particularly domestic violence in drought conditions. So there is an important literature on climate change and conflict throughout the history of humanity. Extreme climatic conditions and environmental conditions have generated crime, violence, and conflict. But usually it used to be man against man. However, what is happening within the household is not a war against women, but I would say that it almost is due to the extent of this problem. And this is not something that has been included in this literature. We believe that this is a very important
No, gracias, Sandra. Voy a resaltar
dimension of what we call the
tú
gender
lo
climate
mencionaste,
nexus.
que es sumamente
Very well.
relevante
The
en
first point
el
that you
estudio es
mentioned is
este
extremely
uso
relevant
de buenos
in your
datos,
study,
datos
and
de
it's the
alta
use
calidad
of
climáticos
good
y que van
data,
combinados
high
con buenos
quality
datos
climatic
administrativos.
data
¿Sí? Creo que es una gran
with
contribución de este
good
estudio y esta combinación de
administrative
utilización de datos
data.
nos
And I
permitió
think that this
determinar de
combination
manera rigurosa y
of the
como vos
use
dijiste,
of this
mencionaste de
information,
manera causal, como
which was
decimos
obtained
economistas,
rigorously and, as you
hallazgos.
said, in a causal
Quisiera
manner, as
preguntarte
we
cuáles
economists
son los
say,
principales hallazgos
is
antes de
very effective.
preguntarte
I would like to
más
ask you, what
detallitos a
are
las
the
diferentes
main
consultas.
findings before I ask you about the mechanism used in order to have these findings? We find that in terms of an increase in droughts in various municipalities, domestic violence faced by women in these municipalities increases almost linearly. And here you can see this graph. We see that there are more drought days and there is a higher incidence of domestic violence. And we don't see domestic violence against men, which, as you can see, is quite low. We also compare the violence against men and women in the public space, and it increases based on what we can see here against both genders. Both there's a disproportionate impact against women because in the public space, violence, aggression is increasing in this complex situation in municipalities, but within the family, within the household, we see that only women are the ones that see an increase, almost 8% of domestic violence in these conditions has shown this increase. So what you have shown us is very interesting in terms of drought, and we can see that there's an increase in domestic violence within the family against women. So all of these findings are very relevant, and based on this, I'd like to ask you if you can share the mechanisms that were used to achieve these results. Yes, of course. This is something that is very important. As I mentioned, we used data that came from the Agriculture Information Service to understand at the municipal level what the most important harvest was in terms of the economics. And then we analyzed harvest after harvest using the information from the Department of Forests and Agriculture. We tried to understand what were the months in which these harvests are more vulnerable. This is the growing season for each harvest. We found that the effects are more strong in the agricultural regions, and of course, during the most important harvest season for the municipality.
This shows that one major mechanism for households is a drop in agricultural income. What does that have to do with the violence against women, you might ask, because how does that translate into violence against women? But in economics, we have three theories about the causes of violence against women. Number one is the bargaining power theory. Under this theory, a drop in relative income of men vis-a-vis women hurts men's relative position in the household and leads to more violence against women because women are, men need women more. And that means that the household needs to compensate and offset that situation with production in the household. Women need to step up to the plate and sell more. And so that improves their bargaining power, according to some theories. The other argument is no, when income goes down in a household, men have an incentive to use what is called extractive violence, using aggression to extract time and resources from women to compensate for the drop in income. And theory number three that is in public health literature is a stress violence connection. So our findings are more consistent with mechanisms 2 and 3. When there's a drop in income, especially agricultural income, there is an increase in domestic violence in response to stress or to loss of income and the need to obtain resources some other way. What you're saying is very interesting, and those are triggers for violence, this relationship between stress and financial insecurity or uncertainty, which are very important risk factors to be pinpointed, leading to violence against women. In view of these findings and these mechanisms behind these findings, I'd like to ask you, in practical terms, what recommendations would you give to a policymaker? No, that's not true. Actually, there are two major recommendations. Number one is to bear in mind that natural disasters are not gender neutral. In other words, there is growing evidence that this climate gender nexus is a reality, but existing programs, at least in Mexico, to respond to natural disasters are gender neutral. So FONDEM, the National Fund to Fight Natural Disasters, for example, does have programs to respond to drought and to recover water infrastructure. But there is no dimension whereby if they were in response to drought to expand the capacity of shelter for women, or for there to be campaigns, awareness raising campaigns for women, so that they can call 911 to be directed to advisory services and support services. I mean, it depends on the state, but in several states there is legal advice that can be provided, psychological support, shelters, and medical care that they can be directed to. Those should be included into the response to natural disasters, and not just drought, but all kinds of natural disasters that take place in Mexico. And secondly, building trust and women's tendency to use these resources, to rely on these resources. So we see at the state level and the municipal level that the two measurements that depend on women's decisions to go to the authorities, meaning police reports and 911 calls, 911 calls, will vary a great deal depending on what the state's capacity is. When it comes to hospitalizations, though, those are not dependent on the level of trust that they have. It's if the injury is bad enough, they'll end up in the hospital. And so we use that as a more reliable type of data. And we don't see as much disparity between different municipalities with higher or lesser capability or capacity. And this builds, the idea is to build trust the lack of trust is also a response to the lack of capability. So we need to put an end to these disparities across the country in terms of access to resources. Thank you, Sandra. You've brought up many relevant points, but I'd like to underscore one that is essential and that you mentioned throughout your answers, and that is the need for policies that not only address the direct effects of climate change, but also address these risk factors that are brought about by climate change and that may lead to this drop in income, in household income, that may lead in turn to violence. So how can policies be designed to protect women from domestic violence triggered by natural disasters in this way, through awareness-raising campaigns, through the giving more, informing women and disseminating the information about services available to them. Right. As you said, public policy should include this. And to do that, we need to generate more knowledge around this. So I feel that these programs are very important, as this will be included into policy making as long as there is rigorous evidence backing it up. So that's very important. That's highly relevant, and I will end my conversation with you there for in the meantime. And now I'd like to turn to you, Julia, and talk about your interesting study. Your headline is the following: public policies should consider that older women are not exempt from suffering partner violence. Although traditionally more attention has been paid to this phenomenon when it comes to women between the ages of 15 and 45 years old, due to the greater availability of data, your study is very innovative because it provides new evidence about the impact of violence on older women. Because of how important these findings are, I would like to ask you the following. Could you please tell us about the most significant findings from your work and the research process that guided you to these findings? And I'm interested especially in hearing from you about the violence against older women. Is it similar to the type of violence experienced by younger women?
Thank you, Monserrat. There are two main reasons for which we were interested in studying intimate partner violence among women of post-reproductive age. The first one you already mentioned is that there is a lack of research and evidence on the prevalence and the determinants of intimate partner violence of older women. And partly because of a lack of data and partly because of the belief that intimate partner violence declines with age, and so younger women are at higher risk. The second reason is that we think it's very urgent and important to study this demographic group for several reasons. First, the global population is aging, and most of the aging is projected to happen in low-income and middle-income countries. Second, older women may experience different forms of intimate partner violence, and they may experience it for different reasons compared to younger women. And they may also be more vulnerable. In particular, it may be more difficult for them to recognize abuse and to report it. We think there are two key aspects in which may be different. One is they may have a lower propensity to live in abusive relationship because of more conservative gender norms, or also because of more stigma. And this is reflected in our data by lower divorce rates, for example, among older women. And second, they may experience different life transitions, such as menopause or retirement, compared to younger women. And so, for all these reasons, we believe that the implications of existing studies that look at intimate partner violence for women of reproductive age may not necessarily translate to older women. The first contribution of our study is to show evidence on the prevalence and what is the relationship between age and intimate partner violence. And first, we look at the definition of intimate partner violence used by the WHO, which is the prevalence of physical or sexual violence. And I should tell you a little bit briefly about the data. We use this very detailed, very granular household survey from Mexico that uniquely asks women aged 15 and older about their experiences of intimate partner violence. And it's in stark contrast to the demographic and health survey that interview only women until age 49. And what we find is that in the context of Mexico, 8.6% of women aged 50 to 79 have experienced physical or sexual violence in the past 12 months, compared to 10.2% of women aged 15 to 49. This means that while it is true that violence declines with age, older women still experience it at a rate that we believe should not be neglected by policymakers or researchers. And importantly, when we look at other types of violence, in particular psychological and economic abuse, this type of violence tends to be more frequent for women of all ages, including older women. So women aged 50 to 79, if we look at psychological violence, about 23% of them experience, and economic abuse, 13% of them experience it. And so the takeaway is that it is true that intimate partner violence declines with age, but it's still high for older women. And interestingly, when we look at the different forms of violence, physical violence does not decline as steeply as the other forms of violence.
Ah, has mencionado puntos
You
muy
mentioned
relevantes.
very relevant
Resaltó
issues,
el punto que mencionas
especially
sí
what you
es
said
importante
about
preocuparse
the
en esta
importance
población
of
por
also
el rápido
being concerned
envejecimiento poblacional
about
que están
this
experimentando
population
todos
due to
nuestros países.
the
Entonces, es
rapid
población
aging of the
que
population in all of our
hay que
countries.
tenerla
So
en
it's
cuenta.
a population,
Has
a swathe
mencionado
of the
varios
population that we
puntos,
need to
pero
bear in
puntos
mind.
de
There are several
cómo
points
es
you've
muy
brought up,
interesante este
but
estudio, cómo
it's also very interesting to see from your work
presenta a través de datos,
how
digamos,
it presents through data
nuestra descreencia que, como tú mencionas, que uno piensa que la
the
violencia
fact
va
that
decreciendo a
we
través
are
de la edad,
wrong in
y lo
thinking
que
that
muestra
violence simply
que
diminishes with
tu
age.
estudio claramente demuestra
And
con datos
your study
sólidos
clearly proves with sound
que la
data
violencia no está,
that
nadie está exenta a
violence,
violencia, ¿sí? No
nobody is
está
exempt
relacionado
from
con la edad.
violence. That's what I
Entonces,
mean.
es
It's
sumamente
not
importante
age
tener en
dependent
cuenta eso al
specific.
momento
And
de
that's something
realizar
that needs
políticas
to be borne
públicas y
in
en
mind
particular realizar
when
políticas públicas para esta
making public
población. Nadie está
policy
exento
and making public
de
policy
experimentar
for this
violencia.
strata of the
Dado
population.
estos
Nobody is exempt from
hallazgos tan
violence.
relevantes y
So,
también
in
quisiera
view of these
explicarte,
very relevant
preguntarte
findings,
si nos
I'd
puedes
also like to
compartir
ask you
cuáles
if
son
you
los
can tell us
mecanismos que piensa
about
que
the
están detrás
mechanisms
de
that you
estos
believe
hallazgos que encontraron.
underlie these findings of yours.
Yes, so the second contribution of our study is to examine for the first time how access to income affects intimate partner violence for older women, and to study this research question, we look at an exogenous shift in women's income generated by a reform of a non-contributory pension program in Mexico. And this type of programs is very important for social protections in low and middle income countries, in particular in context with labor informality, and are especially effective in increasing women's income in old age. And what happened in 2013, Mexico lowered the eligibility age of an existing program from 70 to 65. And this allows us to obtain causal estimates of the effect of income on women's experience of intimate partner violence, because we can compare before and after the reform women in ages who become eligible for the violence and women of ages who are not, eligible for the pension, and women of ages who are not eligible. And what we find is that after women become eligible for the pension, they experience an increase in intimate partner violence. This increase seems to be driven by women who are relatively younger and have been eligible for the pension for at most 2 years, suggesting that possibly this effect will diminish over time. But for this group of women, the increase is sizable. We find that the experience increases in physical, psychological, and economic abuse, and the sizes range from 35 to almost 60%. In terms of mechanisms, we provide evidence supporting two main mechanisms. The first is that men may use violence as a tool to appropriate women's resources or to control their behavior. This aligns with the instrumental theory of violence, which Sandra already mentioned before, that postulates that when women have access to economic resources, violence may increase, in particular for women with low bargaining power. And what we find is that our results are more pronounced for women who experienced family violence in childhood, either because their mothers were victims of intimate partner violence or because they were victims of family violence, and also for women from poorer households. So to the extent that these variables are related with a lower propensity to leave their abusive partner, this aligns with instrumental theory. And we also find that the increase in psychological and physical violence is always accompanied by economic abuse, which really measures these attempts of men to control economic resources. We don't find an increase in psychological, physical violence without economic. And the third, we also don't find an increase in violence when men become eligible for the pension, which is also consistent with instrumental theory. The second mechanism we provide evidence for is an increase in time exposure to the risk of intimate partner violence. Because after women become eligible for the pension, they decrease their paid employment and increase the probability of reporting being a housewife. So this suggests that they may spend potentially more time exposed to the abuse. And it's consistent with research from Brazil, for example, that found this mechanism in the context of unemployment and job loss.
No, gracias, Julia. Y interesante el punto que
Thank you,
resaltas
Julia. That's a very
conectada,
interesting point that you brought
con
up,
el paper
and that
de
is
Sandra, como
is
en
also
este caso
in line with
el
what
aumento
Sandra said about the increase
autonomía económica de
in
mujeres
economic autonomy by women and
actúa como
independence, and
factor de
that
riesgo
becomes a risk factor
para que las mujeres estén más propensas
for
a estos
women
de violencia.
to have more propensity to being victims of
Dado
violence.
también estos hallazgos,
In view of
aprendizajes
these
y los
findings and
mecanismos
these
que hay
lessons
detrás,
learned and the
sí me
mechanisms
interesaría mucho
underlying this,
que nos comentes
I'd like
en
to hear
términos
from
prácticos
you, in practical terms,
cuáles serían las implicancias de
what
política
the
de estos
implications would
hallazgos
be for
y mecanismos.
policymaking of these findings and mechanisms.
Yes, unfortunately, our research has unveiled some unintended consequences of social protection programs that have been shown to decrease extreme poverty in old age. I think the point where our studies result can inform policy primarily is to identify the categories, the groups of women that are at higher risk of experiencing an increase in intimate partner violence after they become eligible for the reform. And in particular, we show that women who experienced violence in childhood are more vulnerable, as well as women from poorer households. One implication is that if the government wants to mitigate these unintended consequences, it may be effective to target these populations. In terms of interventions that may be helpful in mitigating these adverse consequences, we have to be very careful here because, again, all the existing interventions do not look specifically at older women. And I think another important takeaway from other studies is that we cannot assume that the programs that work to reduce violence for younger women of reproductive ages also work for older women. In particular, as overall, the research on cash transfer for reproductive ages shows overall declines in violence or no effect, while we find an increase. But with these caveats, some interventions that have shown to be effective to reduce violence in other contexts for younger women in Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa include programs such as gender training, family coaches, couple dialogues. These have been effective in reducing especially physical and sexual intimate partner violence. So one possible recommendation would be for governments to target women at higher risk, their families with this type of gender transformative program. However, more research is needed for older women because some of these studies show that these decreases in violence happen with changes in gender norms. And from psychology, we expect norms to be more malleable at younger ages, especially in adolescence. They're more malleable, while it may be possible that in older ages they're more entrenched and more difficult to change.
No, sumamente de acuerdo con lo que mencionas. Interesante.
I fully subscribe to what you said, and especially it's interesting to hear you talk about how we can come up with prevention programs that are basically focused on this population. We still have a great deal to learn about this population group, where the gender norms are more rigid, so to speak, as you said. So how can we work on preventative programs for this population group that is also vulnerable? So that's very interesting. And I think there's a great deal to continue to talk about with the two of you, but still, I'd like to now move over to Tommy. Hi, Tommy.
El titular de tu estudio.
So the headline of your study is as follows. Cognitive behavioral therapy in adolescents favors lower risk of violence against women. Tommy, your research highlights the efficacy of cognitive behavioral therapy as a preventative measure by improving self-control and empathy in adolescents. So that our viewers have a clear understanding, could you please, first of all, explain in simple terms what cognitive behavioral therapy is and how it relates this therapy to the prevention of violence against women, and why did you use it in adolescents, in an adolescent school population? Thank you, Montserrat. This is a project that was carried out with high school students in Mexico, just like we heard about the other two projects today. Cognitive behavioral therapy is a type of psychotherapy that tries to modify thought patterns or thought patterns and behaviors based on the fact that they're all interconnected, our thoughts and our behaviors. So the idea is to change negative thoughts that may lead to improvements in behavior. CBT is based on the connection between the situation that leads to a conflict, thoughts, how they relate to feelings and behavior. And this leads to consequences in behavior, or how behavior can lead to a consequence. In certain aspects of an individual's life. And this is used around the globe to deal with violence. And it's been used at redes with some groups of adolescents. And the idea is to adjust our program that is based on CBT for gender issues. So we adapted these tools and adjusted them to deal with gender issues. So more specifically, there is a behavior that we're working on, which is trying to reduce gender violence, gender-based violence. And so we have workshops to work on the thoughts and beliefs that lead to this behavior, to try and change sexist beliefs and attitudes, which leads to the cognitive restructuring of individuals, in this case, adolescents. We also work with feelings around this, so that the young men and women as well can behave differently. And of course, we work with both genders. We work with regulating emotions, communications, problem solving. These are all skills that these workshops try to impart. And why do we work with teenagers? One key thing about this that is not necessarily part of the debate that we haven't heard about today yet are preventative and corrective interventions. Both of them are of the essence. We believe that there is a great deal to be done in terms of corrective, or that is done in terms of corrective intervention, meaning dealing with the problem after the fact. But I think that we should also work on prevention. And prevention work can be done with teenagers, especially for many reasons. Basically, when adolescents start with their romantic relationships, they start experimenting. And that's how you can set a template for the way these kids think early on and how they deal with these issues early on. These relationships create a great deal of anxiety. They don't know how to navigate these relationships. And so sometimes they start navigating them in an incorrect manner. And this is in general terms. There is some literature in psychology that has been used for other disciplines as well, that refers to a period of sensitivity when people are more liable, they're easier to influence, and that happens to teenagers. So whatever happens at this time in life may have longer term effects, and that's when cognitive social skills are more malleable, or they're more sensitive, and it's easier to shape their abilities, their skills when they're teenagers, so as to have longer lasting effects over time. Thank you, Tommy. And there is one very important takeaway from what you said. This therapy hasn't been very much used in prevention, especially for teenagers, as you said, in high schools, where their beliefs and attitudes are shaped. So that's very interesting. Your approach is very interesting in that study. With this in mind, my question for you is whether you could tell us a bit more about the specific methodology that you used in your study, and if you can also tell us, and I know you faced several challenges throughout your study, and they have to do with the implementation of this type of therapy in a school setting. So can you please tell us about those challenges and
Sí, mira, en
how you
realidad,
dealt with
bueno,
them?
el estudio tiene, por supuesto, son varias partes.
The
Es una cosa, los
study, of
primeros
course, was
frutos del
divided
proceso
into
que te
several
contaba hace un ratito
stages. The
sobre el
first stage
rediseño
was this
de este
process that I
tipo
told
de
you about,
herramientas para los temas
redesigning
de género, lo
these
adaptamos,
tools
no solamente para el tema de
to
género,
deal
sino
with
está
gender
adaptado para el
issues,
contexto
not just
mexicano. Esto
gender
se aplica a
issues,
veces
but
se han probado en otros
also
lugares
adapting them
de
to the
Estados Unidos
Mexican
y, bueno,
setting.
adaptarlo
They
al
had been
contexto
used in the
mexicano
United
tiene su
States and they
desafío.
had to be
Entonces,
adapted to
pero al
the
mismo tiempo,
Mexican setting, which
este
had
proyecto
some
tuvo dos
challenges.
partes que
But at
creo
the
son
same time,
importantes.
this
Uno es la
project was
intervención
divided into very
psicomotora, esto que
important
estuvieron
parts.
hablando
One is
los
the intervention itself, and I'll tell you more about
la
it.
intervención en sí mismo que usa
And
estos talleres, tratando de
that's
bajar
where the
los
workshops
principales
come
factores de
in,
riesgo. Y por otra
about
parte, de la evaluación.
to
En
work
general, la
on the
evaluación es
main
la parte
risk
aburrida,
factors. And then there was the
para
assessment.
todo
The
el mundo que
assessment is the
produzca
boring part, so to
ciencias sociales,
speak.
que nos dedicamos a hacer eso y que nos
For
gusta. Pero técnicamente
social
no es
scientists who like to
ejercicio de
do that,
datos,
it isn't. But,
análisis
it's
estadístico
about
para
data
comparar,
gathering,
entender qué
getting
cosa pasó.
information, doing
Creo que el
statistical
proyecto este
analysis, and
hicimos una
trying to
cosa que
understand
fue
what
bastante
happened.
novedosa,
I
que
think
creo que
that
tiene
one
un
thing
valor
that
en
we
sí mismo,
did that was
que
rather
parte de la
novel and
recolección de
is
datos que
very
se hizo
valuable in
fue
and
la
of
elaboración de
itself
unos
is that
test
part of the
neuropsicológicos
data gathering
automatizados
included
que trataban de medir
automated
lo que los
neuropsychological
psicólogos llaman
tests
funciones
to
ejecutivas.
gauge what we call
Funciones ejecutivas
executive
son básicamente un
functions. And
conjunto de
executive
capacidades cognitivas
functions
para
are
controlar
a
y
set of
autorregular la
cognitive
propia conducta.
skills
Es
to
decir,
control or
decir, esto no
self-regulate
tiene que
your
ver
own
en sí mismo
behavior.
con la inteligencia de
So
los
this does not
individuos.
have to do
Individuos con
with
distintos
a
niveles de
person's
inteligencia a lo mejor
intelligence.
tienen capacidades
People with different levels of
distintas, ¿no? Es
intelligence
decir, de la
have
capacidad de
different
sentarse a
executive
trabajar, de concentrarse, de
skills,
hacer una
the
cosa, de hacer otra.
ability to sit
Y
down
entre
and
todas
work
esas
and do one
otras,
thing or another.
muchas de estas cosas está el
And
control inhibitorio, es
some
decir, la
of this,
posibilidad de que
and
a
this
base de
includes
hacer o no
in
hacer alguna
inhibition
cosa en el
control,
comienzo,
inhibitory control,
muchas
being
veces
able
en
to
muchos
stop
sentidos están
yourself from doing
ligadas
something
con
at one
la
point
capacidad de
or
lidiar con
another.
situaciones
And
de
this
violencia.
goes hand in hand with the
Entonces, en
ability
esta
to deal with
parte de
violence.
evaluación, como les digo, diseñamos
So in this
estos test
assessment, what we did was
nosotros
that we
tomamos test que son utilizados en forma regular para
made these
evaluar
tests that are used
funciones ejecutivas
regularly in
y
order
los
to
adaptamos para
evaluate
poder
the
implementar
executive
la
functions. We
recolección de estos
adapted them
datos a nivel
to implement
de la escuela.
gathering this
Ok,
data
entonces diseñamos
for
unos
school
test, una cosa que
purposes.
indican
So
estos tests
we designed
que
a
funcionaban en
smaller
apps, en
version of
tablets y
these
esta fue
tests
una cosa que se
that
utilizó en
worked on
muchas de las
apps and
escuelas para
tablets. We
recolectar
used
información
that in
sobre
many of the
si
schools in order to collect
la terapia
information.
esta que estábamos haciendo, estos
And
talleres
if
que
this
estábamos haciendo,
therapy
tenía
that
algún tipo
we
de
were
influencia
doing,
sobre
if these
funciones ejecutivas.
workshops had
Eso más
some
que nada tiene
influence
que ver
on
con
the
el hecho de que
executive
a veces en
function.
este tipo de
Mostly what
intervenciones
we're talking
uno no
about
puede
with
ver
this
un
type of
impacto
intervention
directo
is the fact that you
fuerte
can't
en
see a
términos de
direct
violencia, ¿no? Es decir,
impact
básicamente
in
uno está
terms
haciendo un
of
taller que a lo
violence.
mejor
Basically,
tiene una influencia
we're
sobre los
doing a
individuos, pero a lo
workshop
mejor
that might
el
have
evento
an
de violencia
influence
o es
on
difícil de
the
percibir porque a lo
individual,
mejor es
but
una cosa que
the
está escondido,
violent
que no se ve
event
o lo
is
que sea,
difficult to
o
perceive,
pasa
to
mucho más
understand
adelante en
because
el
it's
futuro.
hidden,
En cambio,
or
uno
it
puede, en cierto
happens
modo, en
further
forma
on in the future.
medianamente más
So
inmediata,
in
si este tipo
in an
de talleres
immediate
tiene algún tipo
sense,
de
perhaps we
impacto
want to see
directo
if these
sobre
workshops have a direct
los
impact
individuos. ¿Ok? Y en este caso, ver
on
si esto afectaba
people.
o no
And we
estas
wanted to
funciones
see if
ejecutivas
this
o alteraba de alguna
affected these
forma
executive
estas
functions or
funciones
if it
ejecutivas. Y eso es lo que un poco
interfered with
encontramos, que
these executive
efectivamente
functions. And
la
this is what
intervención
we
tuvo algún
were
impacto
able to
sobre esto. En
ascertain,
cuanto al
that this
intervención en sí, como ya
intervention
hemos
did have an
hablado,
impact on this. As we have
no es en sí mismo
mentioned
una terapia, básicamente
before,
es unos
it's not
talleres que
actually
utilizan
a form
elementos
of
de
therapy. These
terapia
are workshops that use
cognitivo-conductual, que
elements
sí,
of
trabajan sobre la
conduct and
reestructuración
cognitive
cognitiva, habilidades de
therapy, the
comunicación, regulación de emociones,
restructuring
resolución de
of
conflictos. Y el aprendizaje en
emotions, the
realidad
solution of
son
conflicts, and so on.
básicamente un
And
taller
the
de una hora
premise
por
is
semana
basically
a
that
lo
this
largo
is a
de 10,
workshop for an
12
hour
semanas, ¿okay?
every
Dependiendo de
week
cómo está armado
over
en
10,
cada colegio.
12 weeks
Y
based
el
on
aprendizaje se
the
lleva
schedule
a
at
cabo
the
a través de
schools.
dinámicas de
And learning
participación
is
y
done through
experiencias
the
con discusiones
participation
críticas y
and
juegos de rol
experience
con
with
los distintos
critical and
estudiantes.
role playing
Esto no es, por
discussions
supuesto, no es una
between
cosa
the
que es
various students.
inmensamente fácil de hacer, es
Obviously,
decir, de vuelta,
this
son
is not something
adolescentes, son chicos jóvenes,
easy
están en
to
un
achieve
contexto
because we're
escolar,
talking
es
about
decir,
teenagers
todo
that
este
are in
tema
a
de
school
evaluación, por ejemplo,
context.
con
And
las
the
tablets, con los
topic
test fue
of
muy
evaluation
facilitado,
with
es
the
decir, nos
tests and the
facilita mucho la
tablets
intervención en la
was
escuela.
what
En
made
lo que
this
tiene que
type
ver
of
con la intervención en
intervention
sí misma,
easier in schools. But
en general el
intervening
feedback que
on
hemos tenido tanto
itself, basically what we've seen, both from the people who did who implemented these workshops as well as the school authorities, and the students are all very satisfied because it seems that the students are responsive to this type of thing. We've also had challenges. This was analyzed in schools. The interaction in the schools not always was easy because sometimes the school authorities have other priorities over these workshops. And in certain contexts, these workshops were not concluded because there were other more important needs by the school. And what we discovered with this type of workshop, there is a need for a smaller group, for smaller groups. We're talking about groups of about 30. Fortunately, his internet connection was interrupted. He was frozen. And so we needed smaller groups. So we were trying to ascertain what the best number of people in the group would be, because that way the school could go along and participate in the workshops fully. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tommy.
Resalto dos puntos sumamente importantes
You
de
pointed
este
out
estudio
two
y
very
uno
important
es
topics that come from
mencionamos
this
recién cómo
study.
esta
First of all, as we
intervención de
mentioned,
prevención se focaliza
how the
en
prevention
factores protectores,
mechanism
como
focuses
señala
on
literatura, así que más
protective
que en cambios
factors,
conductuales,
as
sino
is
en
done
cambiar
in
factores
the
protectores
literature. We're talking about the protective factors,
para que haya menos
not in terms
propensión
of
a la violencia
conduct per se, so that there is a smaller possibility of violence. And another point that you made in all this learning has to do with how to think about these programs, how this pilot program can become used more widely. You mentioned many points that have to do with how you can use this pilot program, adapting the various programs that have to do with the school curriculum and the type of training that is required. I think that is important. It's important to think about these points for the success of these workshops. And given the learnings that you just mentioned, once again, I'd like to ask you the following question. In practical terms, what would you recommend the policymaker in terms of how to implement these programs in a school environment? As I said earlier, I think that these pilot programs, and I think that having more of them might be very useful to start defining and fine-tuning what the format, the ideal format would be. We've discovered that the ideal format requires a smaller group of people, as I mentioned earlier. Likewise, I think that the topic of having a guideline where the school can provide continuity to these workshops over a semester or a school year. So we need perhaps a more centralized policy. Maybe the municipal governments could include this in these children's school curriculum. I believe that many of these tools have proven to be effective and have also shown to be relevant to the children's thinking. So these are the things that I think can be done in order to make them more effective. I think this is scalable, there's no doubt. I believe that there has to be a certain knowledge in the realm of psychology. But once this is all designed and adapted to the particular themes and topics, in this case, we were talking about a Mexican audience, teenager audience. Well, once these things have been pinpointed, then you can have the package that can then be adapted to other groups. I also believe that, I don't want to minimize the value of the evaluation per se, but I believe that there seems to have been an impact on the executive functions. Executive functions are something becoming more and more relevant in psychology discussions, not only in terms of violence, but of performance at school. So I believe that this is definitely scalable. This can be confirmed as working, and it also allows us to see if there is a positive external reaction for the rest of the activities of these children. Of course, they can improve their conduct in terms of gender violence. We want to give them all these tools because that can improve their school performance or later on at work. So these are scalable factors, and we should take them into account, in my opinion. And another thing that I mentioned at the beginning is the importance of working with teenagers. This is a learning curve, which is important when it's still early on. And this can also have a huge impact on society long term. And in this sense, I think that this does uh, is quite important. Thank you, Tommy.
Nos deja
I'd also
pensando
like to point out
cómo pensar y utilizar estos programas
that this study allows us to
terapia
think and rethink these therapy
prevención.
programs,
El
how
potencial
to
de estos
use
programas
them
para
for
prevención
prevention. I think that
en
the
adolescentes en un
potential
entorno escolar
for
que hasta el
prevention
momento no había
in
sido
teenagers
estudiado.
in a
Así
school
que muy valioso el
context
aporte
had
de este
not been
estudio.
studied. And so I think that what this
Para
study
terminar,
provides is very important.
dado todo lo que hemos
To
discutido
end our
el día de
discussion
hoy,
and
los
given everything that
aprendizajes
has been mentioned
que
today,
aportan
the
sus
learnings,
estudios,
the findings,
quisiera preguntarles
thanks to your studies, I
si
would
nos
like to
reuniéramos de
ask
acá a
you
5
all
años
if
nuevamente.
we were to meet again in 5
Quisiera que
years.
piensen qué
I would
titular
like you to
de
think
periódico les gustaría en
what
base a los
your heading,
aprendizajes de
what
su
your
estudio de
headline would
replicancia de
be
políticas.
on the
¿Qué
front
titular
page of
de
a
periódico les
newspaper.
gustaría ver,
What would
digamos,
be the
de acá a
headline?
5 años?
And
Si
what would you like to
volviéramos a
see
reunir
in 5
para
years
terminar de forma
if we were
positiva.
to
Quisiera
meet
también
again in
invitarlos a
order
nuestra
to end
audiencia
positively?
que
And
nos
I'd also
comparta
like to
también
invite
sus
the people
pensamientos,
in
por
the
favor.
audience, if they'd
No
like
dejen de
to
escribirlos en el chat
share their thoughts about this, please write what
de este
your
evento.
impressions and your thoughts are
Tommy, si quieres
on
comenzamos contigo y
on
luego
this
seguimos con
in the
Julia y
chat.
luego Sandra.
Tommy, we
Así
can
que,
start with
Tommy,
you, and then we
adelante.
can listen to Julia, and then we can listen to Sandra. Of course, I would think of many things that we could use as a headline in 5 years. I'd like to see a heading that talks about new generations that are opening up the way and they're able to do all the things that we mentioned. But I think that a more important heading is something that puts this in evidence. I would like to see that we are truly tackling this topic. I don't know if this happens to you. I have been working on policy systems that have to do with crime and violence. For the people that create these policies, this is something that might not ever be solved. So I think that the headlines should talk about this as a policy factor in Mexican schools, for example, to do away with gender violence. And it opens up the path. It opens up the way. This is something that we can do. It is not something that we can't work on. We can work on this. And this is perhaps what I'd like to see on the front page of a newspaper. Julia.
I think in 5 years, the newspaper that headline would be to see a greater action by the Mexican government to reduce intimate partner violence among older women. But to achieve this, some intermediate steps are necessary. The first one is to raise awareness on this issue because it is severely understudied. The second is to collect more data that directly target older women because they may experience violence in different forms, also related to their decline in health and potentially also by other perpetrators. And finally, as I mentioned, I think we need more rigorous interventions um, against IPV that directly target older women, so that we do not assume that what works for younger women may also work for older women. And hopefully, if all these steps are achieved, in 5 years, we can see the Mexican government, but hopefully other government too, pay more attention to the prevalence of intimate partner violence among older women and the risk factors.
Gracias, Julia. Sandra.
Bueno, me gustaron mucho las respuestas de
I
mis colegas.
must say that I
Espero
loved
estar a
my
la altura
colleagues'
de las
answers,
circunstancias.
and I hope to be
Creo que me gustaría
suitable
ver
to provide
un
an adequate
sistema
answer.
unificado
I would like
nacional
to see a
congruente
national
de datos de
unified
violencia, de
system which
prevalencia
is
de la violencia
coherent
doméstica.
in terms of
Digamos, este
data
proyecto nos
on
demostró que lo
domestic
que hay es
violence.
como un entramado de
What we
datos
see is that we have
incompletos,
like a
¿no? Que muestran
network
como
of
distintas
data which are
fotos
incomplete.
de distintas partes
It gives us
del
images
sistema
and
y
photos
me
and
parece que
pictures of different
un problema
aspects of
tan
the system.
importante debería tener
I
un mejor
believe that
seguimiento, ¿no?
such an important
4 de
problem
cada 10
should have a
mujeres en
better
México
follow-up.
han
4 out of
experimentado
10 women in
violencia
Mexico have
doméstica a lo largo
experienced
de su
domestic
vida con la
violence
pareja
throughout their life
y
with
2 de
their
cada 10 lo han
partner, and
experimentado
2 out
en
of
los últimos
10
12 meses
in the
en
last
cualquier
12
momento
months
que
at
uno
any
pregunte.
given moment
Entonces,
have experienced
esta
this.
epidemia,
So this
este fenómeno
epidemic,
tan prevalente tendría que tener
this
como un sistema de
prevalent
seguimiento
trait should
más
have
formal
a
y más
better
serio, así como
and more
México
formal
tiene un sistema de alertas
follow-up.
de género, pero
Mexico
son
does
sistemas de alertas
have
de
a
violencia y
gender
feminicidio.
alert, but it
¿Por
has
qué?
to do with
Porque el feminismo
femicide,
es un crimen
because
que se
femicide
sigue,
is
como
a
mencioné,
crime
es fácil de seguir, ¿no?
that is
Hay cuerpos
easier
y eso es lo que
to
se cuenta, pero
follow up on
realmente
because
sería
you see the
importante tener
body.
estas alertas
So
que
it's
no
important to
requieran,
have these alert
que no sea
systems
solo de
that
violencia
not only
feminicida, y esto sería
regard
posible si hubiera
violence,
mejores
femicides,
datos
and in this sense, I believe
darle
we should have
seguimiento
better information to follow up more
fenómeno.
adequately in terms of
No,
this
muchas gracias,
phenomenon.
Sandra, y les agradezco
Thank
muchísimo
you so
a los
much,
tres.
Sandra, and I wish to
No puedo
thank
estar
all
más de
3 of
acuerdo con
you.
sus
I could not
titulares
agree
porque
more
más allá de
with your
titulares
headings
han
because
resaltado,
aside
digamos,
from all
el
that,
camino
you
y el
have
trabajo que
opened up
tenemos
the way, you
que
have
seguir
shown us
realizando
the way
para
ahead
alcanzar,
to
digamos, ese
see
titular.
what
Así
kind
que
of
es
work
sumamente
we have to
importante.
do in order to reach
Les agradezco
these
muchísimo esta
headlines.
conversación. Yo principalmente he
I have
aprendido
to say that
muchísimo, así
I've
que
learned
espero que
quite a bit
también
from this conversation,
haya sido
and
un aprendizaje,
at the
digamos,
same
para
time,
toda
it's
la
been a
audiencia
learning curve,
que
I
nos
hope,
acompaña.
for the audience
Y
that
antes de
is
terminar,
listening.
quisiera resaltar
Before the
algunos
end of our
puntos
meeting,
de
I'd
la
like to point
conversación
out some of
de
the
hoy.
relevant points
Y
of our
como
conversation here
mencionó
today.
Julia,
And as
es
Julia
fundamental
mentioned, it
reconocer que la
is very
violencia
important
contra
to
las mujeres
recognize that
trasciende fronteras de
violence
edad, y
against
esto
women
subraya la necesidad
transcends
de
age.
políticas
So we have to have
inclusivas que abarquen todas las
policies,
generaciones, y no
policies
solamente
that
políticas,
cover
sino
all
también que
generations.
hay una
Not
necesidad
only
de datos
policies, but
también
we need
sumamente
more
importante
data.
que hay que
This is
abarcar.
extremely important. This is
Segundo, creo que
something to
tanto los
be
estudios de
taken into
Sandra
account.
como
Both
Julia
Sandra's as well
resaltan
as
que tanto la
Julia's
inseguridad
studies
económica causada
point
por
out
desastres
that
naturales o el
natural
aumento de la autonomía económica de la
natural
mujer a través de
disasters
programas de
and
pensiones
the
sociales puede
economic
elevar la vulnerabilidad de
insecurities
las mujeres a la
can
violencia. Y esto
increase
requiere
women's
estrategias de prevención y
vulnerability
políticas que no solo
in
enfrenten
terms of
los efectos
violence. So we
directos
have
del
to have
cambio
the
climático
policies that
o
face
proporcionen
climate
apoyo
change
financiero, sino que
repercussions,
también implementen
financial,
medidas para
economic
proteger a las mujeres del
measures
riesgo
in
de sufrir
order
violencia.
to
Y se ha
protect
discutido
women against violence, gender
muchas
violence.
de estas potenciales
And
políticas.
these have to be included in
Y
many of these
tercero,
potential policies. And
de lo que
thirdly,
surgió
out of what
del
was
estudio
mentioned
que lideró Tommy,
in Tommy's
aprendimos
study
que la
that was
introducción de terapias
headed by
cognitivo-conductuales en escuelas
Tommy's study,
secundarias
the
representa una medida
conductive
preventiva prometedora.
cognitive type of
Sin
therapy can
embargo,
be
como
very
mencionó Tommy,
promising.
hay que
But
seguir evaluando la
as
efectividad de estas
Tommy pointed
intervenciones.
out, we have to
Y
keep
esto requiere
assessing
más
and
investigación
evaluating
sobre
these
su potencial
methods
impacto en lo
because we are trying
conductual
to
y su
figure out
capacidad de ser
their
escaladas. Y esto
impact
implica
in
esfuerzos
a
para la
specific
integración en sus
context.
planes de
This
estudio y
requires an
capacitación de
effort
los docentes.
in study
Y
curricula.
estos tres
And these
puntos,
3
y
points,
ustedes también lo han resaltado, nos llegan a
and
un cuarto,
also
que es
pointed
esencial
them out.
realizar inversiones
Take us to a
sostenidas en
fourth
investigación
point.
para
We have to
fundamentar
have
estas políticas en
sustained
evidencia sólida y garantizar,
research in order to have
garantizar
solid
su éxito a largo
policies
plazo.
to guarantee
Que
that these
muchísimas gracias
policies are going to
nuevamente,
be
Sandra,
successful long term.
Julia y
Once again,
Tommy,
Sandra,
por
Julia,
acompañarnos y
Tommy,
muchísimas
thank you
gracias
so much
a
for
nuestra
being
audiencia
with us.
por estar
Thank
el
you
día de
to
hoy.
the audience for being with us here today.
Para despedirme quisiera
And to
invitarlos a
say goodbye, I'd
participar en
like to
nuestra
invite
próxima
you to
edición de
take
esta
part
serie
in our
coordinada por
next
el G-Lab, denominada
edition
Evidencia
of
para la Inclusión. Así
organized
que nos
by
vemos en la próxima.
the
Muchas
G-Lab
gracias.
Evidence for Inclusion is its title. So thank you so much for having been with us. Have a good day.